Admitting all, and I'll monitor the lobby, Tom. Henry, you'll sort of introduce the session, and yeah, Con will be the able assistant in the background, I guess, but I'm sure you'll come to the fore at some point, Con. Right, let's admit all. Okay, good morning, everyone. Morning, Nick. Morning, Podrick. Morning, Peter. Morning, Rosalind. Thanks for joining. Morning, Shay. Morning, William. Thanks for joining. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that would be brilliant. Thanks, Chris, for muting as well and joining. And that is excellent. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, Derek. Thanks for joining. Welcome, John. Another John. Oh, yep, that's good. Okay. And thanks for joining, William. Really, really good. Okay. Who else is muted? No, that's fine. Cool. Okay. Right. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to this week's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. We're delighted to talk to you today about infrastructure and why financing new towns with gilts won't work. We're delighted to welcome Thomas Aubrey. So Thomas, thanks in advance for your time this morning. We're looking forward to your presentation. In usual Playpen fashion, we are being recorded. So can we have a thumbs up from everybody that we're all happy to be recorded? Thanks very much, everyone. That's good. And we will make sure the video is posted on the Playpen website later on today. If you'd like to chip in with any comments, then please put it in the chat. If you want to ask a question of Thomas or Con, please raise a hand. Thank you, Henry. So without any further ado, Henry, I'll pass to you first, just to maybe set the scene, and then you can introduce Thomas. So over to you, Henry.
Well, you've just done that job for me, Steve, so I won't do it again, other than to say that the timing couldn't be better, because yesterday I think we got the New Towns consultation, and you can follow on from that. So over to you guys, perhaps Con first.
What we actually got was on Sunday, and it was the New Towns Task Force, which was commissioned a year ago by the government to look at and determine which are the 12 most preferred sites to build new towns, of which 3 can expect to be work to begin on them in the course of this Parliament. But the specific conversation that Tom and I want to have today concerns how these new towns are going to be financed, and in particular, why using the gilt market, which seems to be implicit in the task force report, really won't work. And rather than simply saying this won't work, we also offer an alternate form which should work. So with that, I will leave the conversation to Tom to pick up. Tom.
Thanks, Con. Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Steve. Really welcome the opportunity to speak today about why we think the government should not use gilts to finance the next wave of new towns. Now, I'm just going to take you through a few slides before handing over to Con, and that will hopefully start a fruitful discussion. So, first up, why do we need new towns? Well, the map on the left is GVA per hour worked, which is a reasonably helpful description of productivity. And as you already know, the high areas of productivity are in London, sort of stretching up to Cambridge and Oxford, out towards Bristol, and a bit up to Birmingham. Now, the map on the right is where there is excess demand for housing. There's different ways you can do this, but the map on the right looks at ratio of homes per person. And you could look at floor space as an indicator of demand, but it pretty much indicates that there's a lot more demand for housing in high productivity areas. And there's lots of other ancillary evidence that indicates that high productivity areas are being constrained, which is why we have one of the reasons why we have a productivity challenge as well. So moving on to where these new towns are likely to be built. So here are the 12 that came out of the New Towns Task Force report that came out at the weekend that Con mentioned. Now, obviously, this assumes that they're going to be funded and financed. And I don't think that is really has been sort of worked out in sufficient detail yet. There's obviously quite a few of these towns that are in the high productivity areas, but there are some that are not, that are sort of thinking about how you can use new towns for regeneration, with this kind of idea that maybe productivity growth starts rising in the future. The problem, though, with productivity forecasts is they're notoriously poor, particularly in this country, and hence really should not be relied on as a sort of future funding mechanism to drive future higher tax revenues. And that's unfortunately something the Chancellor is slowly realising, which will have a huge impact as the ABR probably will downgrade its productivity forecasts. So for these new towns to work, a significant amount of upfront infrastructure has to be delivered. There's no choice to this. Infrastructure investment has always been a key driver of housing. But the big question is, how will this infrastructure be funded and financed? Now, I don't think, as I said before, the government's really thought about the specifics of this challenge. And so to a certain extent, this announcement should be greeted with some scepticism in relation to delivery. That's unfortunately an issue that many governments have had over the last 10 years. But what they have said, and this does come out in the task force report, is that their infrastructure strategy remains in place. And the basis of that is to use gilts to increase departmental expenditure, alongside its public-private partnership approach, which is essentially a tool to subsidise private projects that are currently not viable without impacting its fiscal rule. Now, to do that obviously requires some financial engineering. So what they've done is to create these things called financial transactions, which come on balance sheet net of their liabilities, which in the words of the OBR, merely just creates a fiscal illusion. Now, in addition to this PPP approach, they've also announced some other funding pots, which were also put into the New Towns Task Force, which was a 39 billion affordable housing grant. Now, at face value, this does seem to really be quite an important step change. But when you look at the detail, a lot of that 39 billion is in fact sort of backloaded into the next Parliament. And as we all know, that parliaments can change and priorities can change. So really that 39 billion is not set in stone. The funding for the rest of this Parliament has been slightly above where it's been over the last few years. So no, that's something, but it's not, as transformative as I think the initial press release indicated, which again is pretty standard for most governments. And then finally, there's a 5 billion pot, an infrastructure fund. But of course, that's for the whole country, for multiple projects. You could easily spend that in, one project itself. And given the infrastructure deficit is about 700 billion, it's hard to see how that's going to be transformative. So challenge is that the government really wants to continue its sort of poor record of delivery by merely doing more of the same, which is just to hand out sort of small grants to subscale projects in the hope, and I stress this, hope, that it improves productivity growth. The challenge with this is that the returns from infrastructure investment do require scale. So, gilt investors, I think, should be worried about all this incremental investment because it's probably not likely to boost growth by that much, while increasing the fragility of the public finances. Now, in addition to relying on hope, in terms of delivery, the government unfortunately continues to pursue worst practice, where the delivery body has no clear link to funding and therefore has no skin in the game. This is one of the major drivers of the catastrophe of HS2. This obviously has major implications for cost overruns and timings, given that somebody else is paying. There's always this idea that, the department's going to pay for it anyway because it's a sunk cost, and you keep going back to the department for more and more. So this is another thing that gilt investors should also worry about, and the National Audit Office has worried about it a lot. To what extent the government is listening, though, remains to be seen. The final point I would like to make is that most other European infrastructure is not built based on the hope of future growth, but rather by identifying future cash flows, which are hypothecated to pay back the bondholders. Now, this is the approach which Victorian Britain used, which I understand was rather successful. Now, it's not just me saying this. When the Chancellor ramped up borrowing at last autumn's budget, yields jumped by more than 30 basis points over Dutch yields. Now, the Netherlands has a similar density and therefore demand for housing and infrastructure the south of England, and hence I think is a very good comparator. So I just move on to the sort of this difference between the typical UK centralised approach to financing infrastructure versus a more sort of devolved public corporation approach, which, as I said, was very much based on the UK approach. So I take fixed assets as a proxy for infrastructure stock. So we look at the infrastructure stock or fixed assets as a percentage of GDP. We can see it's about a third, well, more than a third higher in the Netherlands, and that's just because stuff is funded and financed by those who care about this infrastructure most. It doesn't have to go through some centralised body that makes some decision about who should get a little bit of funding and who shouldn't. Now, the result of this, unsurprisingly, is higher productivity growth. So we can see the GDP per hour in the Netherlands is nearly $93, where it's just under $80 in the UK. Now, the last table shows the sort of driver behind this, which is basically the issuance of public corporation debt, which is paid back by hypothecated cash flows. Now, as per the Maastricht criteria, this is rightly off balance sheet, given that it is a pro-growth measure that does not have much risk, because it does not rely on hope and future taxation. And you see this across, many European countries where this public corporation model, as I said, it was just copied from the UK, is pretty prevalent, where a public body issues debt, and then those various revenue streams from land value capture, from transport receipts, and from business rates and maybe affordable rental housing as well, are used to pay back the bondholders. So in terms of the options for financing this wave of new towns, obviously there is an option just to kind of load up on gilts and just hope for the best. I don't think that's a very good idea. I don't think gilt investors would be too supportive of that either, just given the fundamental governance issues that we have. Now, of course, the Chancellor's saying, but it's not just, more gilts. We're going to use those gilts to leverage private investment. So this is the very famous public-private partnership. But the whole point of the PPP is really to sort of take potential projects that are just not currently viable. So in essence, is giving a subsidy to the developer to meet their profit thresholds. And that might work for some small scale projects, but it's not going to work for a new town where you have to put in large amounts of infrastructure. And the private entity just not going to be able to generate the returns that they require. The other challenge of going down this PPP approach is that you can't use land value capture. And that really is responsible in the sort of this public corporation world between about a third and 2/3 of the funding mechanisms. That's a lot of money you're suddenly losing. And then, of course, there's the option, which is the sort of tried and tested option, which is the public corporation debt, which was obviously how a lot of Victorian infrastructure was financed, the garden cities as well. Now, obviously, the new towns, they did use the Public Works Loan Board, but obviously they were the standalone entities and responsible for funding. After the war, I think there was a good reason for the Treasury to do that, just because capital was scarce. But I think today capital isn't scarce. It's just a question of having good quality projects that can give a decent return to investors. So should the government decide to go down this tried and tested approach, what would that mean for investors? Well, if we're going to go down the sort of new town bonds approach, you might get typical issuance of sort of 20 to 40 years. We think the typical coupons would be gilts plus 50 to 100 basis points. Crucially, though, that we're going to have best practice governance rather than worst practice governance, where we have aligned incentives, where the body responsible for delivery is also responsible for funding and financing. And investors are pretty much then betting on the future of those regions that are issuing the debt, whether it's London, Cambridge, Bristol. We know that there are lots of high productivity firms there already, and many of these firms do want to expand but can't, just because of infrastructure and housing shortages. So, just in conclusion, I'm going to say that relying on gilts to fund this new wave of towns is not a good idea, because it relies on hope. And in my view, hypothecated cash flows are far less risky than hope. And with that, I will stop.
I think I'll just come in and make a few points. It's important to realise that in and of themselves, new towns and new housing will not improve productivity overall. The productivity gains that come from offering this housing is by allowing further residents, further workers to live within areas which are already high productivity, and perhaps where there is constraint on wages and similar things because of the housing problems, see some further increase in productivity in those areas. But productivity is a second order effect with new town building. On the other hand, it will, as construction takes place, boost growth, boost economic activity. That's just worth remembering. Now, John Mather asked a question which I'll answer immediately, which concerns whether or not 60 billion is cash ISAs, 60 billion and 360 billion in cash ISAs. Why not sell some of these bonds to them? Well, nothing wrong. Yeah, these funds do not buy gilts as is. Would they buy gilts at higher levels, the higher levels which would follow from gilt issuance? And you're talking about probably a 50 to 100 basis point further yield premium on gilts arising from the levels of borrowing that's required to fund these new towns, if the government were to do it. They are presumably moving cash and keeping cash in cash ISAs for a reason. But is there any problem with selling the bonds that we are proposing to issue, the local development authority or development agency bonds, which would be 50 to 100 basis points over gilts? But they would be 20 to 40 years, which is rather a large leap, John. I don't see the cash ISA market as being a significant source of funding for these things, because new town developments are inherently very long-term projects. Now, what I did want to talk about was what happens when things go wrong. Now, it's interesting to start with that the first three choices for new towns are, well, one is Brownfield, which is the Leeds South development, and there's already work on new rail facilities in that area underway. So that's continuing. In and of itself, Leeds South was very much the down market part of Leeds. Then there's a development which is between Enfield and Potters Bar, and is infill to housing in the London area. Finally, they have also chosen as one of the three to be started on Thamesford, which is about 10 or 12 miles to the west of Cambridge. Now, Cambridge, in the last round of new town developments, eco towns they were known as, Cambridge was one of the sites for that. And there is an eco-town development already underway in North Stowe, which is 10, 12 miles to the northeast of Cambridge. Now, there's no two ways about it. This was intended to be a 10,000 home development taking place over the years. By last year, it was projected to have 3,000 homes built. As best I can see, you can just about get to 1,600 homes having been built, and the first were occupied basically in 2017. So you're talking about a rate of home building that is 200 homes or so a year. As for any of this stuff being affordable or social rent, I couldn't find any reliable statistics on what was or wasn't affordable among those that had been built. But what I did find, and all I found, were congratulatory press releases, one saying that 24 homes had been released as affordable, and another of 42 homes which appeared to be social housing. This is not anything like the 40% affordable of the task force report. It's nothing like the 20% social, which is supposed to be a government target. It seems that in the case of North Stowe, what we had was use of Section 106, where the developer promises lots of affordable housing alongside their high margin developments. And then as the project goes along, they whittle away the social element or the affordable element until it's almost non-existent. And they seem to have achieved this spectacularly well in Cambridge. It's interesting that government releases seem to think, and they have been releasing land at a rate which assumes that they have already reached the 3,000 home point, which was the target, and they're nowhere near there. Now, my daughter is an academic in Cambridge. One of her colleagues has the misfortune to live in North Stowe, and I had a long conversation with him. There's no town centre in North Stowe. There isn't as much as a cafe. There is no GP. The nearest A&E unit is Addenbrooke's, which of course is to the south of Cambridge. Then they made a big deal of there being a specified dedicated bus route between North Stowe and Cambridge. There is a bus. It runs from Longstanton Park and Ride, which is the village next to North Stowe, to the west of North Stowe. And it stops at St Ives Park and Ride, which is the park and ride for Cambridge North. So if you want to go shopping in Cambridge, you first have to take yourself to Longstanton. You then take the bus to St Ives Park and Ride, from where you get yourself to Cambridge North Station and take the train to Cambridge proper, from which you then have to take a bus into Cambridge Centre. The fare from Cambridge North to Cambridge is £3.20. This is just a complete and utter joke. I asked my daughter's colleague what if he could do one thing to sort this problem out, what would it be? And he said, make the bureaucrats and planners live here for 5 years. Now, no town centre, 8 years, not even a vestige of a town centre, 8 years into a development just doesn't make sense. Yeah, my daughter's colleague, I asked my daughter's colleague why he still lived there, and he said, quite simply, because I can't get my money back. So, you know, we have to get the holistic planning and financing of town centres unified and clear if these things are going to be built in any sensible way. Now, Thomas, there's a question in the chat. Can we have an explanation of the Weird Homes UK and all of this? Why don't you tell us about Homes UK?
So just before I do that, I think what Con has just described there is a classic example of not an infrastructure-led project. It's just let's see how many houses we can get out. And I think I did try to emphasize throughout my slides that this only works if you put the infrastructure in up front. And actually, that's one thing that the New Towns Task Force absolutely has recommended. The challenge, of course, is that putting infrastructure in first is where the money comes. And I think that's why, you know, UK governments have not really been wanting to do it, because when they look at how much it costs, they've always said, oh, this is going to, you know, not look very good on our fiscal rules, basically. So I think this, for me at least, gets to the heart of the issue. So moving on to the question on Homes UK, I assume that you actually mean Homes England, whoever asked the question. But so, yeah, I mean, Homes England's obviously been set up as a body to try and accelerate housing, work with the private sector. They have quite large budgets, and they were obviously quite heavily involved in that Northstowe project as well. I mean, I think part of the challenge is that, you know, whichever body you look at, nobody really has the depth of funding to actually put the infrastructure in. And so what we have is this challenge where you've got lots of little bodies and pots of money, and everybody does a little bit, but they sort of keep missing the main point of trying to get this sort of built environment off the ground, which is you need to put in good, high quality infrastructure. You know, if you look at any development across France or Netherlands or Germany, Sweden, etc., the first thing they always do is put in the infrastructure up front. Why is that? Because once you've got that, you can sell off all of the parcels of land to developers. And because you've already got infrastructure there, people want to live there, you know, so it becomes a bit of a no-brainer from that perspective. But it does come back to that. What is that mechanism that allows you to put in the infrastructure up front, given obviously you have some sort of maturity transformation to make from you know, short-term cash flows to pay for the infrastructure, and then sort of some long-term borrowing process as well. So hopefully that answers that question.
Can I add a follow-up on that? Because one of the things that seems to be obvious is that builders are not particularly keen on building these properties. Why aren't builders taking the chance and getting on with developing these sites, such as the one that Con has mentioned?
So that is potentially a very complicated question, but I'll give a very simplistic answer, which may or may not be helpful. But I guess there are two things. One is that where there is obviously less infrastructure up front, then the demand is going to be lower. And if the demand is going to be lower, you're naturally going to slow your build-out rate. So I'll give you an example of where we didn't have a slow build-out rate, which was the King's Cross development done by Argent. But you know, Argent had a very high-quality development there, but they were building it in probably one of the best connected places in the whole of Western Europe. And they didn't have to pay for any infrastructure. Somebody else had already put it in. So I think that becomes a really important driver of this. And then the other thing is that obviously the typical model for generating, earnings for a UK house builder is very different from a continental European house builder, because obviously in the UK they're taking the planning risk and having to go through a lengthy process, and they're getting quite significant increases in their profit margins coming through the increase in land values. But they obviously have a very high return on capital. It's about 30%, whereas it's very hard to get good data, I have to say, in France and Germany, but it's significantly lower. And the reason behind that is because they're buying, in general, service plots from these larger projects. And so the differentiation in the house building market is much more to do with sort of quality and those kinds of things you'd expect in other kinds of markets. So they're just a different business model, I would say, in the sort of quote unquote Anglo-Saxon world to the sort of, more of the development corporation approach.
Okay, there's a question in the chat asking from Christopher Giles, asking why Leeds South Bank is chosen as one of the first. I think the answer to that is because it's already underway. A lot of the infrastructure development, particularly the rail stations and so on, is already underway, and Leeds South is being they are pioneering, or not quite pioneering, but modular housing is going to have a significant part to play with Situ, which builds German-style passive house developments, is deeply involved in the whole thing. That, I think, is the simple rationale for Leeds South Bank. The Christopher also notes that the Bank of England dropping the projected sales of gilts from the quantitative easing program resulted in a decline in interest rates. I think that most of the decline in interest rates was actually due to a decline in treasury yields at that point in time, but there's probably half of the 20 or 30 basis point decline that we saw due to the QE or QT announcement. It's significant that the bank has had to deliver very, very substantial sums of money, £87 billion in the last 7-day repo. This is funding for the banks to compensate for the sale of gilts, generally, the sale of gilts from, in particular, the QT program. So, a decision by the bank to lower borrowing to 70 billion from 100 billion is an indicator of just how sensitive the gilt market would be to borrowing for housing purposes. Now, as for who is providing security for development authority bond issuance, this can be done through the rates, through land value capture. It could even be done with government guarantees. It's a question of looking at the finances of each project case by case as to what they are. John Mathers also added in the comments that he lived in Crawley in the early 60s, and that the experience at Cambridge was just the same. There's a comment from Berg. It's about planning. There's a reference to development that's taking place, private sector development, presumably around Crawley. I unfortunately don't even know the area at all.
Would you like to ask that question, Porrick? Because you might clarify on that to Con.
Oh, it's not really questions. I'm passing comment. There's a whole swathe. I've got friends that live in Horsham, and the last 10 years we've seen what look like housing developments along the A264 mushroom into enormous estates, and only to find out, some of the people only found out when they moved into them, that the requirement for things like GP surgeries, primary schools and the like had been dropped in the final phases of development. So you had thousands of people moving into an area with already stretched infrastructure, with no likelihood of getting it, thanks to the councillors and the planning department signing off on the developers being able to withdraw the need to offer these social assets.
Yeah, and that's, I just to perhaps come in on that. I mean, that is pretty much our entire approach to development across the UK, because if a private sector developer, you obviously don't want to pay for all that other stuff because it's going to reduce your return on capital. And so in the desperation to keep, housing numbers up, we just kind of have this speculative house building that no one seems to like. So, I mean, there are some major changes that went through the last Conservative government, mainly because most Conservative councillors just dislike this approach to house building. So they have reintroduced the sort of land value capture mechanism that the new towns use, where they can now acquire land at pretty much close to use value. And then once you put the infrastructure in, and then you can sell off a service plot to a developer. So that's pretty much how the private bits of Milton Keynes were developed. I think Milton Keynes is about 50% council housing, and then the other 50% were built by house builders, but they were buying service plots already with planning permission. So that is quite a transformational change that the Conservative government brought in. Now, the government's response to the New Towns Task Force has made it clear that that's what they want to do. Unfortunately, the Treasury seems to have a different view. The Treasury wants to have this PPP approach, but of course the PPP approach is just going to give more of the same, that all of these bad examples you've just described, because if you're doing a PPP approach, you can't use land value capture. And certainly I've done a lot of modelling for potential development corporations around the country, looking at what the upside is going to be. And in general, the land uplift you're getting is, as I said, it'll pay for between a third and 2/3 of the overall projects, which is really quite substantial. But it's just not going to happen if the Treasury continues to pursue its current approach.
Can I ask if you've got any good ideas about how we might do this right? Because thus far it's been a fairly negative meeting. I mean, we've discussed about problems, but we haven't talked about how we might use, for instance, pensions, which is what we're about, to sort of provide something which is both value to investors and, importantly, useful to people who actually purchase or rent these houses.
I mean, certainly I guess I didn't sort of stress it enough on my last slide, but the alternative is to do what everybody else does across Europe and what we used to do, and have development corporations issuing debt. So the question for the people here would be, how interesting would be 20-year paper, let's say 100 basis points above gilts. These would typically have at least an A- credit rating, maybe a little bit higher. Obviously, you want to look at the risks of these things, but in general, you're pretty much betting on is Cambridge going to be around in the next 20, 30 years with demand for housing, etc. So I think there are certainly ways of minimizing the risk, but that is the product which is potentially on offer. If the Treasury could get out of its own way. There are certainly other parts of government that are interested, I think, in exploring this kind of approach, and there is a mention to it in the New Towns Task Force. But I mean, that would be the alternative, and that's pretty standard, I'd say, across Europe, where large funds, both pension funds, some sovereign wealths are buying this kind of paper.
Okay.
There are also a couple of questions here, Henry, from a couple of hands up from Christopher Giles and William McGrath. Should we go to?
Fire away. Chris, do you want to
Yeah.
make your comment?
Can I just say something? It's more of an admin thing for your admin team. I don't know why my name's suddenly been changed from Chris to Christopher over the last week. Maybe somebody could look into that, because as Con knows, everybody, I've been known as Chris for all my working life. Yeah, the first comment on, the last comment I made about Leeds South Bank, that was entirely flippant, owing to the fact, of course, I don't know where it is outside Leeds, but of course it's the Chancellor's hometown. So that was just a flippant comment.
It's emphatically in the middle of Leeds, Chris.
Oh, is it? Oh, right.
Yeah.
So this is actually...
it's the southern half of it's a chunk of the middle and the southern half.
So it's next door to her constituency then, is it?
Absolutely.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, now you can see why I made the comment.
In fact, parts of it are probably in her constituency.
Okay, can we move?
Yeah, should we get to the so the serious bit? I actually live in. I'm interested in this map and these places on here because in terms of communication and existing connections, because you said problems with Cambridge, etc. So I live in East Devon, about 10 miles east of Exeter. We've had a town, not of this probably size, going up at the moment, a place called Cranbrook, which is on the north east of the Exeter Airport. And I noticed there's a new proposed development called Malcolm on the just to the south of Exeter Airport, but very close to the A30 interchange and obviously the airport as well. So therefore, that looks as if it's reasonably a reasonable proposition from communication point of view. I don't know Plymouth, but the other one that interested me, which is the Bramerson and West Innovation Arc, which I gather is in the Bristol area. Once again, I would have thought that is very well provided for communications wise. So it comes down to the local economy in Bristol. Interesting the name Brabazon, because one of the big developments that's, shall we say, taking longer than it should, property development, is at Filton Airport, which of course is closed and has been sold off to various people. There is the old Bramerson hangars at Filton Airport, which were where Concorde was developed. They are being built into the largest outdoor or indoor music venue, probably outside London or any of the major cities. It's potentially a 20,000 seater stadium.
That Bristol Arc includes the Filton airfield within its geographic area. Yeah.
Just a note on that. So the Highways England have rightly said that Brabazon cannot build more than, I think it's 3,000 units until the infrastructure has been put in. Bristol has got one of the worst infrastructure of any town, city across the UK. And as I said before, a lot more housing could be put in if you had proper infrastructure up front. But unfortunately, the cost of infrastructure is high, so that area could be, you could have tens of thousands of extra houses if you had proper infrastructure to facilitate, the movement of people from their home to the place of work, to hospitals, to sports arenas, and all those amenities and green spaces that people expect of a new town. So I think, to be honest, all of those new towns, I would say all of them have got infrastructure challenges. And if they're not solved, then all you're going to get is all the bad issues that everybody's been kind of bringing up on the fore here, where nobody really wants to live there. If you don't have a GP surgery or there's no school, I mean, it's just, it's about as bad as you can get from urban planning perspective.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting, Chris, you mentioned Cranbrook. I was told an anecdote by someone the other day. Cranbrook apparently still has no town centre. He said what it does have is a sign which was erected on the approach to Cranbrook, which said, "Coming soon," which is now in such a state, a new town centre. And apparently the sign is now in a state of complete disrepair, and the town centre is still not built.
No, it's not really a town. It's a commuter suburb for Exeter, and there is a railway station, and there is a bus service. So yes, you're right. It's not a separate community, but in terms of size, we're about 10, 15 years in since that was started. It's probably about 5,000 homes now. Ultimately, it'll only be 10. Am I right in thinking that most of these new towns are sort of 20,000 plus in terms
Well,
of size?
they're saying 10,000 plus,
Right.
but many of them have the capability to go a lot higher than that. William McGrath, you have a hand up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was very interested in the idea, the reference you made to King's Cross, which I think is a staggeringly good development. And I was interested, if you look at things where things seem to be going very well, I think Brent Cross West, which is another by the same folk, but it's all about the infrastructure being in place again. And you can see why that is going to work. I can see why Potter's Bar will work. It's just really about infill, and it's about an intelligent approach to some of this infrastructure. But I think pulling the threads together with also the pension dimension, it was interesting that BT had a big investment in King's Cross. And maybe that's where one of the areas where you could get a bit of people taking a close interest in what's going on. If you had some of your larger pension schemes actually making direct investments in some of the infrastructure and some of the development programs themselves. So maybe a few things could come together. Maybe UK large pension schemes looking to make direct investments in projects. Obviously, with the new definition of net financial liabilities, the government does have more scope to maybe back some of these bigger projects. So I think there are opportunities if there is a mindset which is, yes, we need to do this. Maybe leave out one or two of the more difficult projects and just say, yeah, of course you've got to do the infrastructure. You can see why Leeds will work. It's right in the middle. You can see that has a lot going for it. So if you could get a combination of government latitude with the definitions, which is obviously I think actually a big point, plus some of the large pension schemes actually making direct investments, you could actually maybe end up with a better framework for actually seeing this more holistic approach develop.
Well, yeah, I think the key point here is that the planning and the whole approach, complete with finance, must be holistic. Yeah, otherwise you finish up like with messes such as we've seen. I mean, it's very interesting. Lots of people say that the Stratford development was the Stratford Olympic Park development, which was a form of Newtown development, effectively, all brownfield, obviously. Now, I lived there for 6 months. Yeah, there is a shopping centre at Stratford. It's about 1.5 miles from Bomley by Bow, which is the other end of the development. There were no pubs, there was no cultural life. I lasted 6 months and moved out. Yeah, that was it.
I would say now, Con, that it is actually very good. I think again it shows that those infill developments, as long as you don't support West Ham, are actually doing quite well. But it does take a long time to. And I think the underlying point is start with the infrastructure and work back is so obviously the right answer that I think all the ones you can think of are good. You think like that. You start with the answer and then work back to attracting people. And it seems to be something that could happen if
I can't help
how it might be financed.
I can't help feeling that part of the problem with Stratford, because I went by there recently, shortly after the local credit union collapsed, where the area where I lived, there were 2 or 3 tower blocks when I lived there. There are now about 12 or more. It's just massive tower block after tower block. That's not going to develop any form of culture. Darren, you've been waiting very patiently there.
Yeah, I've been listening to this with interest because I have a partner who's moving house now, and it just seems to me that if you want to improve economic growth, productivity, or whatever, you need to build houses where people want to live, not where you want them to be. So my partner was quite keen on a new development because the house is done. But I very quickly worked out that this would have been a disaster, because it's like buying a new car. As soon as you buy a new house in the middle of nowhere with no GP surgery, you lose 20% of the value as soon as you take ownership of it. She then looked at Portsmouth, where she has family, and by complete chance and coincidence, I was reading a book called Crap Towns, and Portsmouth was up there, and she wasn't particularly mathematical. She had the option, when she got divorced in 2008, to move into Portsmouth. She chose to move to Guildford, and she asked me to work out what the value of her house would be in Portsmouth had she moved there in 2008, and I worked it out, and it was about £500,000 less than buying a house in Guildford. Nobody wants to live in places in the middle of nowhere, so you need to find ways of making the planning system a bit more national and putting houses where the growth is, and that, unfortunately, is London and the southeast. Now you redistribute that after that is another question, but I totally take the point that, you know, who wants to live in a housing estate in the middle of nowhere with no GP surgery, no school, and the developers will lie and build more properties on your land. So that was just my view on it. I think the government are going about, I think getting rid of the planning system as it is makes sense. You know, I, as it stands, have to get planning permission to extend my conservatory by 1 metre, which is of no interest to anybody around here. That stuff needs to go. And I think that's how you deal with it.
Yeah. We've got a comment from Bobby Rodaway. He's on a train, so he may not want to deliver it himself. But I think the thing that's come up in this meeting, which is that pensions may be candidates for this. That's what Bobby's brought to the party. We haven't had LGPS at this meeting, which is disappointing. I did ask whether anyone would like to come along. Do you feel that there is a local feel, which can help get this right, Thomas and Con?
Yes, go on, Thomas.
I just say one thing is that there are some areas that I've been working with that are coming up with bold, ambitious plans that can be funded and financed. There's no question about it, and these are infrastructure led. So the Treasury is obviously very anxious because it doesn't like, the fact that people are trying to do things in the right way, because the way that the fiscal rules and the public finances have been set up has been not to support that kind of investment. The fundamental basis of our fiscal rule is not to do those kinds of things. It's actually to stop it and ensure you've got centralised investment handing out small amounts of grants. So there's a bit of a clash at the moment as to what people want to do. And I think there is genuine interest, certainly discussions that I've had, of local pension funds being very interested in, acquiring 20, 30-year debt, 100 basis points, as long as the risk profile of these things are sufficiently good. But that's just not the way that we've been doing things the last 30, 40 years. And so I think until either the government decides that they want to do this and really want to have infrastructure-led projects, which are without doubt, financially viable and won't impact the public finances, I just think we're going to have more of the same. And that ends up being a decision by politicians, because in the end, the Treasury will do what the politicians tell them to do. But obviously, they've been told for the last 20 or 30 years to do it in a certain way. But obviously, that hasn't led to particularly good outcomes for our built environment and new housing and for growth either.
Henry, Shay McCarthy has a hand up.
Thank you, Con. I just have a slightly different business model to share. So the way it works in South Africa is that the government is really amenable and they bend over backwards to help the private sector get things through. So what will happen is you'll have a new area and immediately they'll put up a private hospital and then they'll put up a private shopping center, and the private sector investment funds will invest and back these assets. And when they put up a new development of, say, about 300 or 400 houses, they will just get filled overnight. Of course, we don't have trains in the country that really run, so people drive in cars. So the transport links are not the problem, but the government makes it easy for the private sector to put up the assets and the infrastructure they need, and that in turn is backed by the private financial sector, and pension funds would then invest in those funds like Allan Gray, and they would back these assets.
Well, all of our utilities are these days owned by the private sector, but their performance does not fill me with anticipation of good delivery on anything. I think one of the serious problems is actually going to be, with particularly the Cambridge developments, the provision of water. That's not a given. Cambridge is in an area which is somewhat water deprived. The private hospitals will not supply the services which are provided by the NHS. And there needs to be an NHS hospital within reasonable distance. The problem for Northstowe is that to get to Addenbrooke's, you actually have to go around Cambridge, because if you are in a hurry to get there, you certainly wouldn't want to try to travel through Cambridge centrally.
I think the other point I'd make is that is, Shay, pretty much what the current government's view is. That's the whole point of its public-private partnership. But the challenge for that is that you just can't build sufficient scale, particularly when it comes to transportation. And so that's why it's only ever going to continue with more of the same, with all of these speculative developments that we've been hearing about.
Yep.
Sorry, Darren, you still have your hand up. Do you want to make another point?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Okay, no worries at all. Well, look, we're coming to the end of our call today. So perhaps I can hand things back to Thomas and to Con to sort of conclude and give us a sort of a next steps, really, that we can take away from this meeting, which could be helpful however we are involved in pensions and in finance.
I think the next step that perhaps I'd leave out there is, what would your interest be in buying reasonably risk-free 20-year paper and 100 basis points that would fund great places to live with good transportation and green spaces, places to where there is demand for housing, and job creation as well. So I guess that's the sort of thing I'd like to leave out there. It may be that 100 basis points, 20 years isn't that interesting when you're looking at your own risk performance profiles. But if it is, then I think we'd love to have more detailed discussions on those potential offerings.
Con, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I think we've made the point that the planning arrangements need to be holistic. They need, and it's clear, and it is a recommendation in the task force report, they need to be run by a development agency. That is clear. That's the only way in which you can possibly make them holistic. As for the market, it's clear that the gilt market is extremely febrile. We really will not see significant amounts of funding being raised in the gilt market by the Treasury to finance this stuff. Basically, it won't happen if we attempt to follow the Treasury market model. Will pension funds and insurance companies buy bonds of this form, development agency bonds in general? Yes, of course they will. And it won't just be pension funds and insurance companies. We'll see these being bought all over the place. And I suspect that the right yield spread is, and you're talking probably 20 to 40 year debt instruments, that 100 basis points over, 50 basis points over, somewhere in there is the spread. And they are perfectly saleable. They make sense for pension saving. They make sense actually for lifetime ISAs. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, thanks very much. Perhaps we ought to have others and politicians coming on this who have got something to say about it. It's certainly something that Reform has talked about a lot with relation to LGPS. And I'd be very interested to hear if Mr. Dice has got anything to add. I don't know if you had any conversations with him, Thomas, and whether Reform's councils might be interested in your idea. But we'll put that to one side.
Actually, my idea for Reform is we actually declare independence for Clacton, send it to America.
Yeah, I'm aware of your views on Reform, but the fact is that more people support Reform than just about anybody else at the time, so we can't very much ignore them, Con.
Do they?
Well,
Holes are notorious, Henry.
Well, all right, okay. I do think it's a really important subject. In answer to Thomas's question, I mean, if there are people on this call who know people who are in the business of raising or basically diverting money into these kinds of arrangements, well, let's be having you. And Thomas is the man to speak to. I'm going to be distributing this video, and I'm going to leave us on that note. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Thanks for staying with us. I look forward to distributing this. And most of all, I'd like to say thank you to Thomas and to Con for putting the slides together and for delivering what really has been the most interesting meeting.
Yeah.
Can we wave our hands and say thank you very much?
Thomas, are you
Thanks,
happy
guys.
for the slides to be, can you send us a copy of the slides?
Yeah, I can do that.
Are you happy to be? Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, it's fine.
If anybody wants the slides, please contact Henry or myself, and we'll forward the slides on. But great session. Thank you very much, Thomas, and thanks, Con. Brilliant.
Great. Thanks, guys.
That's great.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.
All right.
Thank you very much,
Brilliant.
everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye. Bye.